So this suit was filed this week, and it is styled as the United States of America versus the state of North Carolina.
Sure. Hi, and welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King, Editor-in-Chief of Carolina Journal. We've got a lot going on, a lot of news from the court and North Carolina's latest budget revenue forecast. So we're going to be talking about a lot. Please stick with us. Make sure you comment below. We want to keep this conversation going and hear what you have to say. Joining us this week, we have Mitch Kokai, Senior Policy Analyst at the John Locke Foundation, and David Larson, Managing Editor of Carolina Journal. Okay, this week, a legal challenge over UNC's possible connection to the origin of COVID, and a federal lawsuit is targeting the state over our voter rolls, and there are tariff tensions, of course, as the White House addresses tariffs and rolls back some of those deadlines for the EU. We'll talk about what this impact is going to have on North Carolina. Let's start with you, Mitch. Let's talk a little bit about this case, about UNC and the ties to COVID's origin.
Yeah, the case that's actually now at the Court of Appeals deals with the public records request, but we know that for a number of years, really ever since the earliest stages of the COVID-19 pandemic and people wondering how did this start, what's the origin of this COVID-19 virus, that UNC has cropped up as one of the possible links to this virus coming to pass. And so the lawsuit that's in the Court of Appeals is over a public records request that a group called US Right to Know has been trying to get information from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill ever since the summer of 2020 about the work of this fellow named Dr. Ralph Barrick. Okay. Now you might remember Carolina Journal reported late last fall that the former head of the CDC on a podcast actually said, I think this developed in a lab at UNC with this guy, Dr. Ralph Barrick.
So it's down the road.
Yeah, so it's not completely conspiracy theory put on the tinfoil hat that UNC had something to do with this. Apparently, Barrick does some research on infectious diseases. There's some sort of tie-in to the Wuhan lab in China where COVID-19 was officially thought to have started either from a lab leak or from some bat at some stall somewhere, the competing theories. But anyway, the lawsuit is over whether UNC can use a research exemption that's in state law to bypass the Public Records Act. Because most everything that comes out of government is supposed to be a public record. But there are some exemptions, and one of them is university research. And so UNC claims much of what this group, US Right to Know, is trying to get is covered by this research exemption. The group, the activist group, doesn't agree. And so they're in the Court of Appeals trying to get the court to say, no, a lot of this stuff that we're seeking about Dr. Barrick and his work is not exempted from the Public Records Act. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that from a transparency perspective. But one of the reasons that Carolina Journal wrote about it is because it's so interesting, the whole COVID origin and whether it's tied into UNC or not.
Sure. What are your thoughts about this? Because this isn't about whether UNC had something to do with the origins. It's more about whether we have a right to know about it.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part. I mean, the group's name is US Right to Know. And I think from the very beginning, as Mitch said, of this COVID pandemic, there was kind of smoke there, whether or not we know exactly what some people say. They were mailing things back and forth. They're kind of working with the Wuhan lab. I'm not going to pretend to know the details on that, but I do think it probably rises above the, North Carolina state law has public record, something that tries to make it a minor, administrative thing with state law, because this rises to the level of a global pandemic where whole nations were shut down, and that people have, just so this doesn't happen again, if there's research being done of that dangerous nature in our own backyard, for North Carolinians' benefit, but just for people in general, we should probably have the right to know. And I know people at Carolina Journal and other places that we've spoken to say they've put in public records requests on this topic and have been told this is something that we're not going to send any records on. So, it's...
But could it be an intellectual property issue? I mean, we paid for the research, right?
Maybe, but it just seems like we'll see what the courts say, but it's of such importance that Yeah, maybe they'll be able to get out of it, but it does seem like the kind of thing that if your government is doing, in the aftermath of this global pandemic, these kind of things should be laid to the public and for everybody to know exactly kind of what happened and how can we avoid this again.
Sure. What are the repercussions you think from this?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think part of this case is a very great interest to lawyers who like to look at details of how laws are written, because one of the debates is about whether the proprietary information that is at issue here covers what's being requested by U.S. Right to Know. And apparently the law is written in such a way that you have to decide whether the word proprietary only deals with the word information, or whether it also covers data and research, and it depends on how you're parsing the way that the sentence is written. And so lawyers are debating one way or the other. Basically, the argument from the U.S. Right to Know folks is that what that law was really designed to cover was information that might be equivalent to a trade secret. So say that researchers are doing something, they haven't yet copyrighted anything, and this is something that might end up being some commercialized research or something, it's a trade secret. You can keep that secret, but just basic data and research and other
Public
things
safety,
should not be part of that. And they said if the courts look at this exemption to only cover something that would be equivalent to a private sector trade secret, that's okay. But don't use this research exemption to block almost every piece of information that might be subject to a public records request.
Do we have a timeline for this? Yeah.
It'll be a while, because what happened this week was a court filing from U.S. Right to Know. There will be a similar court filing from the university, probably a reply from U.S. Right to Know. Then the case may or may not have oral arguments, and then it could be months or longer before the Court of Appeals issues a decision. And then even then, that might not end it, because if one side or the other doesn't like what happened from the Court of Appeals, it could end up going to the state Supreme Court, which would probably add months, if not a year or more, to the end of the process.
Could be a really long road.
I was just going to say, it seems like a little bit of a blanket denial for the public records request, when people probably aren't looking. The information people want is probably not the exact details of a proprietary research, but what were the connections between the Wuhan lab and Barrick, or things more like that is more what people are probably interested in.
Very interesting.
One final little stat to throw out there is there are a bunch of numbers in this court filing about how many requests were made and the number of pages and the number of pages they actually got.
But we issued a bunch.
but apparently in the first request, the university said that there was something like 336,000 pages that would respond to the initial request, and U.S. Right to Know ended up getting 6 pages. Out of 336,000, they got 6. And so later on, they requested, and it'd be like 954 pages, and they would get 200 of them, and back and forth on that. And much of the exemption was because of this research exemption. Sometimes it was other things, but it was usually this research exemption that is the source now of this court dispute.
That is one thing that we've talked about internally at Carolina Journal Newsroom. The public records process is laborious, and sometimes it's literally just waiting people out. If they ask for documents, you'll see a lot of government agencies, not necessarily what's happening here, but it sounds like it could be, they just wait you out. They just send you a little bit, they hope you forget about it, they hope you get busy, and you have to stay on it. You have to keep filing these requests and keep filing these requests to eventually get anything.
And there was the bill from maybe last session or the one before that said they're the ones who get to decide too what even counts as a public record, what needs to be archived and what can just be shredded digitally. And so, and also, there's not specificity in the law where by this date is a reasonable amount of time. So because I believe it says a reasonable amount of time, or with, whatever, but it needs to have probably a little more specificity like some other states have, in order for them to actually be moved to give you what you're asking for.
Yeah, we need to be re-examining our public records law for sure. There's another lawsuit. First, let us know what you think about this. This is something that we've been talking about, covering a lot in Carolina Journal. Go over to carolinajournal.com. You can kind of read the backstory on it. Also, the Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Justice, has filed a lawsuit against North Carolina, claiming that our state has failed to maintain proper voter rolls. So it says that we have a high number of inactive or ineligible voters. This is the Trump administration suing North Carolina. It's something we've been talking about a lot here. Tell me a little bit about this suit.
Yes, so this suit was filed this week, and it is styled as the United States of America versus the state of North Carolina.
Sure.
And the State Board of Elections and all of the members of the Board of Elections and the new executive director of the Board of Elections. And basically, this revolves around the same issue that came up in the 2024 lead up to the general election, that what the federal government is saying is that the State Board of Elections failed to follow the Help America Vote Act law by keeping accurate voter rolls and ensuring that people who are registered have provided a driver's license number or last four digits of the Social Security number. If this sounds familiar, yes, this was part of the whole Jefferson Griffin versus Allison Riggs case. Remember that this issue cropped up in the summer of 2024 when the Republican National Committee and North Carolina Republican Party filed suit saying, look, there are all these people who the state registered violating the HAVA standard, and at that point they talked about 225,000 of them. Right. And what the Republicans were asking at that time was for either the board to drop those people from the rolls, or more likely, force them to cast a provisional ballot and then go back and check and make sure that they have the information they were supposed to have. Courts didn't allow that to happen. The election went forward, and then when Jefferson Griffin was looking at a loss to Allison Riggs, he was looking at various places where there might be ineligible voters, and one of them was 60,000 plus people who exactly fit this category. So even though Jefferson Griffin and his pursuit of the state Supreme Court is over, this issue isn't over. The Justice Department filed suit, and it'll be interesting to see what happens now from the State Board of Elections perspective. My guess is, with the new Board of Elections, now 3-2 Republican majority, and a new executive director who, right after this suit was filed, said, hey, this issue is well documented, and I'm committed to bringing us into compliance. My guess is it's not going to be a long, drawn-out court fight, but that the State Board of Elections, under its new leadership, is going to be interested in doing exactly what the U.S. Justice Department is saying they should do.
Do you think it's possible the DOJ was waiting for this new board to be in place?
It's possible. I think that we have talked in the past about sue and settle schemes and how they can often be a bad thing. I think this is a case where the ultimate outcome might be a sue and settle arrangement that ends up with something good, where you have more election integrity, accuracy in the voter rolls. Remember that one of the big things in that Jefferson Griffin-Allison Riggs dispute was that the Riggs folks focused quite a bit on Jefferson Griffin targeting voters and trying to suppress votes and keep people from voting, whereas he wasn't saying that voters did anything wrong. He was always saying the State Board of Elections is the bad guy here. They were supposed to do something they didn't, and that meant that some unknown number of potentially illegal votes was cast. So now, with the new State Board of Elections oversight, my guess is the board's going to be much more interested in trying to deal with this, and maybe the Trump Justice Department is just going to be moving that forward a little bit more quickly since there's litigation.
Sure. What do you think this new board is really going to be focused on? We've talked a lot about, just in one fell swoop, Auditor Bullock was able to appoint a new leaning majority Republican board and a new executive director. It was a big change all at once.
I think they'll be focused on, complying with statute, and things like this. Who knows the exact reason why the last board just decided to put out forms that didn't require those HAVA numbers, but that created ambiguity, and I think that kind of ambiguity and that kind of, do we know exactly how these court cases are going to go, or are they going to have to, send out votes even if it's not people's fault, maybe we can't verify. So all that kind of ambiguity, I think, leads to, among the public, a lot of people who just have a sense, something's not quite right. So I think getting that sense that you can trust North Carolina's election process, because there are a fair amount of people who they have this sense that there's something wrong with things like the HAVA numbers or other things. So I think that probably be a big focus for them is just to get the public's trust back in the election process in the state.
Right. We have an article on CarolinaJournal.com. It'll be out later today about some reaction to some of those folks you're talking about, the Voter Integrity Project, some of those that have said, look, we got a problem. So yeah, make sure you check that out and let us know what you think. We want to hear from you. Tariff tensions, let's talk about that. Okay, so we've been following the tariff thing. If you are a Carolina Journal reader, you know that we have been tracking this pretty closely because North Carolina is so impacted by tariffs, textiles, agriculture, manufacturing. We are I think like in the top 10 of import-export states, particularly with the Port of Wilmington. The White House looks like they are going to, change the deadlines for the EU negotiations to July 1st, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this has been kind of a yo-yo seesaw kind of process where Trump gets frustrated. In the latest one, he said he got frustrated with Europe because they're not making enough progress on our trade deficit.
Okay.
And that we have too big of a trade deficit with Europe. As Mitch wrote a good column on this a couple weeks back, that it's not really a bad thing. That if you ask economists, is it a bad thing to have a trade deficit with another country? It's really not. And we have a deficit in terms of some manufactured goods that we take in, but we have a trade surplus in terms of services in a big way. And when it all comes, everything's balanced out. We have probably the biggest GDP in the world.
Sure.
So overall, we're fine in terms of how much money we have, and I mean we spend too much in the government level.
Right.
But I think he sees that as a negative thing. So he's hitting at Europe and saying we're going to hit you with a 50% tariff, and then now he's rolling that back to we're not going to do that. What I thought was interesting, I think just today, this U.S. Court of International Trade, which I wasn't totally aware that existed, but they come out and said, you know what, never mind to all of this. All of these tariffs are illegal and they exceed the president's power. So that means the 10% across the board one, that means the Mexico and Canada and China ones in the EU.
I don't see how a global court would have jurisdiction over.
I guess it's
a
U.S.
court.
It's a
US
U.S.
court.
Court of International Trade.
Got it.
So, but yeah, they. So we'll see how that goes because I'm sure Trump's not going to just say, "Oh, okay." He's probably going to see if he can push back or go to a different court, or he's going to do something. But that, after that happened, the global stocks rallied and did well, which kind of shows that, business people don't like this.
Right.
And they want certainty so they can invest.
It's the moving target, right?
Yeah,
certainty is the greatest predictor. If they know for sure it's going to happen or they know for sure it won't, that's the stability.
And we've been hearing that from a lot of business people where, there's a 50% tariff, or there's not. If you're quoting somebody on something that has to cross the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, that's a big difference, and people aren't necessarily willing right now with that uncertainty to have their prices change that dramatically, because that could make the difference between profiting off of something or a major loss. So.
Yeah, of course, and in manufacturing, raw materials. The tariff situation, this sort of emerging tariff global trade policy impacted North Carolina's revenue forecast out this week. It scaled down. They cited things like automobile sales and the impact on transportation, and that global tariff trade policy means North Carolina may take in less money this year.
Yeah, and remember, it's all a forecast, so
Sure.
so it's not as if they're already seeing a direct impact from the tariffs,
Right.
but people plan ahead. You
Yeah.
have to plan ahead if you're in a business. You have to say, okay, what is it going to look like in terms of what I'm going to be paying for my raw materials or my goods?
Sure.
Will I have tariffs? If you're uncertain about it, you kind of have to plan for the possibility.
Yeah, you couch it a little,
And so, and I think one of the things that that should be clear is that the best thing to have is a good policy.
Okay.
But if you're going to have a bad policy, at least have that bad policy and have it be in place so that everyone could say, okay, we know that policy's there, we're going to take account of it.
Right.
What you don't want is what we've had the entirety of the new Trump administration, which is, we're going to have a tariff on this. Well, maybe not. We're going to have a tariff on that. Well, maybe not.
Right.
We're going to have a tariff on that. And then we're going to raise it again, but then we're going to lower it. And if I like what you did, then we'll take it off. I mean,
Right.
basically, it has been Donald Trump saying, we're going to do this, and then changing his mind. And businesses can't plan on that basis.
Right.
And so I think, if I remember correctly, what the Court of International Trade said was that the president can't put these tariffs in place based on the emergency powers that he was trying
Okay.
to use.
Okay.
So it's not as if tariffs, bad policy as they might be, are illegal. Congress could put tariffs in place easily because that's certainly within their power. Congress could even delegate to the president that he could put tariffs in place. But the president was trying to, without any role from Congress, saying, hey, there's an emergency. I'm going to use my emergency powers to put in tariffs. And I think the court said, you can't do that.
And I mean, if you can say trade deficits are an emergency that allows him to micromanage the whole global trade system, that sets a precedent for when Democrats are in charge. They can say, which they've tried to many times, that many of their priorities are emergencies.
Right.
You know, climate change or you name it.
Remember Roy
Slippery
Cooper?
slope, yeah.
Remember
Slippery
Roy
slope.
Cooper and
Yeah.
his education emergency in
Right.
North Carolina.
Right,
You don't
right.
want to grant unlimited power. The reason emergency powers are usually in place is because sometimes there's a pandemic that is wiping people out, or there's a war, or something that really there's not a way to make quick decisions. So you need that, but it gets abused so
But that
frequently.
said, I mean,
Yeah, and if
it is
trade-
a bargaining chip. I mean, this is what a lot of Trump supporters are saying, that he is a master negotiator, and the way this has evolved shows that, you know, he was barking up the right tree, that people are coming back to the table and willing to do it. Still creates that uncertainty.
Creates the uncertainty, and I think people who have been following this very closely and
Right.
looking at where things were before Trump started talking,
Yeah.
where they were once he started talking about tariffs, and then after he makes a deal, where things are. Many are saying, look, you know, the tariffs are higher now than when he started talking about this. I mean, if he had just not said anything, we would have been in a better situation.
Right.
So I think the number one thing for the economy and for the businesses operating in it is certainty.
Sure.
So if you're going to have tariffs, it's a bad policy. It's not going to help anyone. But have them and just know what they are and don't change them.
Sure.
But don't come back and say, well, we're going to do this, we're going to change that, because that just throws out any planning
Right.
for the future and stops businesses from being able to predict what their conditions are going to be like in the future.
And not
And to-
just businesses, but also governments.
Yeah,
you know, you're
governments
like, what's our
too.
revenue
Right.
forecast? So.
Right, exactly. And to the point earlier that Dave was making about an emergency, if trade deficits are an emergency, they've been an emergency for 50 years because the last time the U.S. ran a trade surplus was 1975.
Wow. I mean, you know, some of these policies, speaking of White House policies, I've been loving watching this Doge thing over the last few months, because waste and inefficiencies and all these crazy things are exactly what I think voters went out in November and elected him to take care of. You know, these are things that have been frustrating people for years. Well, we finally have a bill going through to codify some of these cuts that are going to take that Doge work and put it in statute. Now, the question is, what do you think? Do you think here's actually, we've also gotten some protests, of course, Doge protests across the country, here in Raleigh as well. Here's some of what anti-Trump, anti-Musk, anti-Doge folks said down at the Capitol just a few weeks ago.
So what are you here protesting today?
To stop Doge,
100%.
basically the takeover of the United States of America by an unelected billionaire.
The dictatorship overtaking our country.
We're protesting against the self-interest that is shown time and time again by the Grand Old Party, by the Republican Party.
What is your opinion on Elon Musk?
I never liked him because, I mean, there's never such thing as a good billionaire anyway. I wouldn't shed a tear if we deported him back to South Africa.
Unfavorable. Very unfavorable. I saw one of his cars in the parking lot, and my first instinct was to key it.
What percent of the current national debt and federal budget is spent on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid?
I think I know this one. I think it's about 15%. It's probably not a lot. It's probably like 12 or like 13 or so. 8, 9, I don't know.
Would y'all be interested to know that it's 50% of our federal budget?
Is it?
Yeah.
What you think about this Doge bill? You think it has a shot of getting in?
Yeah, I think what ends up in there are things that definitely the Republican majorities are not too scared of cutting.
Okay.
You know, maybe I think NPR's funding
Sure.
and USAID, things like that. You know, that I think
And PBS. I mean,
and
PBS.
PBS.
Yeah.
So I think they targeted things that I mean, Musk really went in there and tried to find things that we're spending money on that we probably don't need to.
Right.
So this is an area probably where, you know, if we're critical of Trump on tariffs, like cutting the size of government, finding waste and getting rid of that, I think, you know, the Doge could have found a lot of things, and it looks like they
Right.
have in that bill. So I think that's good, but Musk is now on the way out.
Sure.
I'm unsure if it's like he's completed his task here. Here's the Doge Bill, so he's leaving the White House. Or he also criticized the big, beautiful bill a little bit, and so maybe he's not quite on simpatico with Trump. But I think this is kind of the right attitude to have, is to what can we
Sure.
cut from this giant federal government.
Waste is a huge problem, government spending.
Yeah, getting rid of the things that government doesn't need to spend money on. And remember, we're talking about the federal government. Most of what's supposed to in our constitutional system happen in government should happen in the states, and the federal government should do things that only the states can't do, like national defense.
Sure.
But much of what the federal government does is something that's really beyond what it's supposed to do. But we have to recognize that if you really want to cut the federal deficit and deal with the issues that are lingering for all of us as taxpayers, you're going to have to go way beyond what DOGE has done and do something about entitlements, because that's what's driving the train. The Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those things are really driving us to the point where in the not too distant future, we'll be paying more on interest on the debt than we are on some of these programs that people are complaining about now.
Do you think that there's chance, is there appetite, is there the stomach to do this?
Right now, no,
Right.
because the Trump administration definitely doesn't want to, and I don't think Congress, there's not enough of a vocal chorus within Congress to do anything about it. I think everyone who looks at the numbers knows that's where the money is, and that's where you're going to need to make changes, but no one seems to want to do it.
Sure.
I think Doge at its best does cut some fat, but at its worst, I think it could be a distraction, a big kind of noisy, here's us cutting a bunch of stuff without actually addressing, well, as Mitch said, what really needs to be, because there really isn't an appetite, I think, when Paul Ryan, when he was speaker and he was looking at, okay, we really do need to address the entitlements. People
So
started
you never
having.
heard from him again.
You never heard from him again.
Grandma driving
grandma
off the
going
cliff.
off the cliff.
Sure.
So I think people all know this, but they also know that this is a third rail that gets your career over, like Paul Ryan, if you actually talk about it. So the only people that maybe have the courage to do it are people whose whole persona is wrapped up in it, like a Thomas Massey or Rand Paul, something like that. They can say it because everybody's, they're kind of out there. But I don't think it's going to be solved until maybe we hit a crisis, or people just realize the magnitude of these programs. Maybe we can keep them in some form, but in the form they are, they're not sustainable.
Right. And remember, Matt, you mentioned Massey. When Massey came out and talked about, hey, we really need to do this other stuff, then Trump comes out and says, someone ought to get this guy out of office. So, I mean, anyone who really wants to talk about this in a way that's serious and is addressing the issue is likely to run up against a president who will call for them to be ousted.
Right. All right, we're going to be tracking this really closely. Make sure you check out carolinajournal.com and let us know what you think about this. We've covered a lot of topics here, but budget. We're managing our home budgets, we're managing our business budgets, and the state government is now negotiating the state budget for the next 2 years. So probably next week, hopefully next week, we'll have maybe an agreement. I don't know. They're trying to get out by the end of the month, and we'll keep checking back here with us at Carolina Journal. We'll keep you informed. Did you learn something? Make sure you subscribe to Carolina Journal's YouTube channel and watch the Debrief every week, where we're going to be breaking down everything happening in your state government. And check out carolinajournal.com for the latest breaking news.